Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com, talking with immigration lawyer Vince Lalonde. Vince, good to see you.
You too, Sean. How's it going?
It's going well. I guess you might be a little bit excited because news about this program has been a long time coming. Today we're going to talk about the plan to reform the Quebec Immigrant Investor Program. Before we dive into that plan, Vince, maybe give people a brief recap of what the Quebec Immigrant Investor Program even is.
Yeah, actually, you're right, Sean. I am kind of excited about this. I'm a little bit of the nerdy investor immigration lawyer in me is happy to see the program back.
Yeah.
Actually, this is really like the OG of investor immigration programs globally. A lot of people forget that Canada was really the first place to have a viable investor immigration program. And the Quebec program was the principal investor immigration program globally for years. This is before the days of Caribbean citizenship by investment, before any European golden visa programs came along. If you talked about investor immigration, this is what you were talking about. So yeah, I'm happy to see it back. And I'm also happy to see investor immigration coming back to Canada, because actually right now we don't have an investor immigration program in Canada. So a lot of people might be surprised to hear that, because if you look around on the internet, you see other companies' websites, there is Canadian investor immigration listed on some of those sites. But what we have now is, I would describe as entrepreneur immigration. So we do have programs in Canada right now for people who are willing to come to Canada, roll up their sleeves and start a business here, hire employees, manage the business on a day-to-day basis, and sell their goods and services in the Canadian marketplace. But those are entrepreneur programs. We don't have a passive investor program in Canada right now, despite what is being marketed on the internet.
Right. Canada did have, at one time, they had the Quebec program, and they also had the federal investor immigration program, both of those.
Yeah, you've been doing this for a while then too, Sean. You remember the federal program.
That's right.
Yeah, so the federal program was shut down in 2014, I believe. The Quebec program was suspended in 2019. And, there were good reasons for suspending the program at that time. The processing times were really, really long. It was taking years and years for people to get their permanent residence under this program. There were some questions about the economic benefit, how much this program was really benefiting the Quebec economy. So they decided to take a pause, just put the program on hold, and go back and reconsider how they could maybe make some changes to the program and make it more beneficial.
Okay, so let's dive in. Right now that they're talking about a plan to reform it, we've got right here a draft regulation published on June 7th, 2023. We're recording this in June of 2023. Talk about what's going to go on with this 45-day consultation period and such.
Yeah, so you're right. It's important to keep in mind that this is just a draft. Okay, so everything that I'm telling you today in this presentation could change. Okay, so they've come out with a draft regulation, which is a really positive sign, and that was actually released yesterday. Today we're recording this on the 8th, so it was released on the 7th. And now there's a 45-day consultation period. The public is free to give their opinions or their suggestions about changes that could be made to the draft legislation, and you're free to do so. If at the end of this video, if you have comments or suggestions about the program, then you're free to provide those comments and suggestions to the Quebec government. You can just send me an email. I'll tell you how to get a hold of them. I might have some comments myself, and so it's very possible actually that the actual regulations, when they come into play in 2024, could look very different from the draft that we've seen today. To be honest, I don't think it's going to look very different. I think it'll be pretty close, but there could be some changes.
Okay, so we've got it scheduled to reopen in 2024. I've seen online that people are saying January of 2024. We don't actually know that, but we are guessing, or it seems good to assume that it will reopen in 2024. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the target, and January would be nice. But yeah, they've stated 2024, so we're pretty sure it will happen. Things could change, but right now it's looking like next year. Yes.
Okay, so let's go into the draft. We've got key criteria here. Talk about this.
Yeah, so so I'll talk about the criteria. Some of these are the same as the old program, and there are some new ones in here. Okay, but a lot of the key criteria have remained the same. They're the same as they were in 2019. Okay, one of those is the net worth requirement. Okay, so you need to show that you have at least 2 million Canadian dollars in net assets, and that also includes your spouse's assets. So don't worry if the property is in, your spouse's name. It's all considered the same pool of assets as far as the Quebec government is concerned. So this sounds like an easy requirement to a lot of people, because if you have a bachelor pad in Hong Kong, there's $2 million right there. But just keep in mind that with this requirement, you also need to explain to the Canadian or to the Quebec government where these funds came from. So you need to show that the funds were legally acquired. Okay, and that can be difficult for people from some jurisdictions where a lot of business is done, in cash or, off the books or whatever you want to call it, under the table. So not everybody is able to show how they accumulated their assets. That's really been the main sticking point for us over the years with the Quebec program is, helping applicants to explain and prove how they made all their money. We're pretty good at it. We've been working with the program for a long time. PACE has been around for 40 years. We've been doing immigration for over 20 years. So we have a lot of experience with the old program. So in a way, it's good for us that this hasn't changed, because we have experience helping applicants to provide the documentation, gather the documentation, explain to the officers in a clear way where their money came from.
Okay.
The next requirement, 2 years of management experience, that's also unchanged. Not too difficult for most people, but just keep in mind if you're heir to a fortune and you spend your days on a yacht in the Mediterranean or whatever, and you don't work, even if you have billions of dollars, you're not going to be able to participate in this program. They want people with management experience.
All right, and the new one here at the bottom with the have at least a secondary school diploma.
Yeah,
that's an interesting one.
It's kind of surprising that it wasn't in there before, but they used to have a points grid.
Right.
They eliminated the points grid, so they brought in some kind of basic requirements like this, have at least a secondary school diploma. I don't think that's going to be an issue for people.
Right. Okay, let's move on to some more stuff we've got. And here's, kind of the big stuff that people want to know right away. The question is, how much does it cost? How much do I have to invest? Go into these investment details.
Yeah, sure. So obviously the main requirement of the program is the investment. It's in Quebec Immigrant Investor Program. So that's the principal requirement, is you have to make an investment into a Quebec government-run fund. Okay, but it's still a passive investment. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, it's an investor program. You don't need to run a business in Canada. You just need to pay the money. Okay, the money needs to stay in the fund for at least 5 years, and the total investment is 1 million Canadian dollars. So that's actually down a little bit from the previous incarnation of the program. Okay, before it was shut down in 2019, you had to invest 1.2 million Canadian dollars. So the investment requirement is actually down a little bit, but now they've introduced a non-refundable financial contribution of 200,000 Canadian dollars. So before it was 1.2 million all investment. Now it's $1 million in investment and $200,000 in non-refundable contribution to the Quebec government.
It's interesting to see the word contribution in there. This slides it. I mean, I'm kind of hearing Antigua and things like that, and that's where you hear the word contribution.
Yeah, it made me think of the Malta program. The Malta program has an investment component and a contribution or a donation, whatever you want to call it, component.
Right.
So it's probably if we had been talking about a non-refundable financial contribution 10 years ago, it might have been controversial, but there are a lot of international jurisdictions now that have investor programs that are using this type of contribution. So not so much an investment, more of a donation.
Right. And here we have, again, the investment still guaranteed by the Quebec government.
Yeah. And that's always been a key selling feature of this program, is that it's a zero risk. I mean, unless you think the Quebec government's going to go bankrupt, it's a zero risk investment. So, almost every other investor program on the market right now, whether it's a golden visa program in Europe or Caribbean citizenship by investment, or especially the EB5 program. And with EB5 investor program, the investment has to be at risk. It's stated specifically in the requirements.
Right.
So this is a really positive feature of the Quebec program, is that the Quebec government guarantees the investment. So it's zero risk.
Talk about this financial intermediary stuff. Whenever we talked about it before, it gets a little bit sticky. I think people kind of don't recognize what they can do with the financing and such.
Yeah, so actually, this is a really positive feature, I think, of the program as well. There are financial intermediaries, so I call them facilitators, so that they're companies that will help you make the investment, and they also can arrange financing for your investment. So that's another positive feature of the program that thankfully they've chose to retain. You're able to borrow the money basically to make the investment. So you don't need to come up with the entire $1 million out of pocket. Instead, you can work with your financial intermediary to arrange a loan. And what happens is the fund, you just pay the interest, the entire interest for the 5-year period upfront, and the financial intermediary will arrange for the $1 million to be paid from the lender to the government. It will remain with the government for 5 years. And at the end of the 5-year period, it will be repaid to the lender as principal of the loan amount. So it's a lot. I mean, you can still invest the full $1 million if you want to, but most applicants that we've dealt with over the years prefer the financing option. Okay, just pay the interest up front. You don't need to worry about it. You don't need to worry about getting your money back after 5 years. It's just clean and simple. So it's, I don't know how much the interest payment is going to be at this time. Interest rates go up and down, so I can't tell you for sure. Yeah, as we've seen in the last year or so. But my guess is that between the non-refundable financial contribution and the interest payment and the application fees, legal fees, et cetera, it's probably going to cost applicants between 400,000 and 500,000 Canadian dollars at the end of the day.
Right. So, I mean, it is a 5-year investment of $1 million. That's the price tag that hangs on it. But in reality, if they go the financing route and with your help, it can be essentially half that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But that's non-refundable. I mean, you don't get that back because you're just paying interest and the non-refundable contributions. So, so it's a significant increase in the cost from the previous incarnation of the program. But I don't think it's going to be, obviously it's going to be a disincentive for some applicants because there are cheaper programs on the market right now. But hey, if you want to make a passive investment and Canada is the place you want to come, you're not interested in Europe or the Caribbean or the US, then I think it's still in the range of, a lot of people's budget.
Sure. And I mean, like you say, there are cheaper options out there, but they're not in Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you want to play ball in Canada and have a Canadian passport eventually and such, this is the option that looks like it's going to become available. So this is the one to go with.
Yeah, especially if you're interested in passive investment.
Right. We have work permit / residency here. So there are some other requirements. Let's go through some of these.
Yeah, this is really the big change to the program. I mean, the financial contribution, it brings the cost up a little bit, but generally the structure on the last page, the investment, isn't that different from what we had before. The big change is here, the work permit and residency requirement. So basically what they're doing now is it's similar to what we're seeing with, for example, P&P programs, provincial nominee programs in other provinces. You're not going to be, if you're approved by the Quebec government and then subsequently by the federal government, you're not going to be a permanent resident right off the bat. Okay, you're going to be granted temporary residency in Canada for 3 years. Okay, so that's either a work permit or a study permit or a work/study permit. Your family can come here. Okay, the principal applicant, spouse, children can all come and work or study in Quebec. Okay, and and you have to fulfill that step, that work-study step, before you can qualify for permanent residence.
Right. I mean, before it was only, what was it? They made you basically sign and say that you were going to stay in Quebec, or you promised to stay in Quebec, or at least that was your intent. And now they're saying, wait a second, there actually are some time periods that they put on this, including the 6-month stuff. Go into that.
Yeah. So you're right, though, Sean. That was a big complaint about the previous incarnation of the program, was that the applicants had to sign a letter stating that they planned on living in Quebec. But at the end of the day, very few chose to settle in the province of Quebec.
Right. I mean, if I don't, let me interrupt you for a second, because if I'm right, I mean, Canada has mobility rights in the charter. You can't force someone to stay in a province. So really, it was just lip service to make this signature.
Exactly. Yeah, and they couldn't do any. I mean, it was unconditional permanent residence. Okay, there have been other programs in the past that were conditional permanent residence. The old Canadian entrepreneur program, which doesn't exist anymore, that was conditional permanent residence. This was unconditional permanent residence. So, like you said, we have mobility rights. Once you're a permanent resident, you can live where you want to. So, very few people were living in Quebec. A lot of the other provinces weren't happy about that because they felt that the investors were settling in their province and driving up the price of real estate and houses, and they weren't receiving any of the benefit because the funds were still being invested in Quebec, but the families were going and living in BC and buying expensive houses and putting their children in there, and in most cases not paying tax.
Right.
So this is a way to address that issue. They're saying, okay, you can participate in the program, but yeah, you're right. You have to come and stay here for at least 6 months. So the principal applicant needs to stay for 6 months, and the principal applicant's spouse also needs to stay for 6 months. It's not the same 6 months, okay? They each need to stay for 6 months. But if you don't fulfill that basic requirement, you're not going to qualify for permanent residence.
Okay, and then at the bottom here, we have proficiency in French. Anyone who's been paying any attention at all to Quebec politics, over the decades, but in the last year, they've been making a really big deal about new immigrants knowing their French.
Yeah.
And this is no different now. They put level 7 on a French test that you have to achieve.
Yeah, so out of all the requirements and all the changes that we've been discussing today, this is the biggest one. This is, if anything turns potential applicants off of this program, it's going to be this proficiency in French requirement. Okay, thankfully, they don't need to show proficiency in French at the application stage. Okay, they have to show proficiency in French after they've had this window to live in Quebec for 2 years. Okay, so theoretically, you could still apply for the program with 0 French, as that's how I'm reading the draft regulations, at least.
Right.
You'd apply with no French, but then you'd have to get going and really hunker down and learn French as quickly as possible when you arrive here. Because level 7 on the Échelle québécoise des niveaux de compétences en français. How was that, Sean?
It sounds good. Yeah, you're halfway there. Okay.
Yeah. So if you level 7 is not easy. Okay, it's intermediate, but it's the sort of the higher end of intermediate. Okay, so basically what this means is that you can communicate without an interpreter. You can communicate with people independently in French without somebody sitting beside you to help you translate. It doesn't mean your French is perfect. Okay, maybe there might still be some issues with communication. Sometimes you don't know how to express yourself, but you're able to paraphrase, or if somebody's talking to you and you don't quite understand what they mean, you're able to infer what their meaning is. So you're not perfect, but you're able to communicate independently. So that's a pretty high bar. And I think, like I said, if anything is going to dissuade people from participating in this program, it's that new requirement, the French requirement.
Right. On the flip side, it could persuade people that know their French. That gives them an advantage.
For sure, yeah.
It thins the herd, as it were, on the number of people applying, perhaps, and they can get a leg up on others.
Well, I think that's part of the reason that they've brought in this requirement, because one of the problems with the old program was the long wait times. And
Sure.
The long wait times were definitely compounded by the fact that there were too many people applying. So if you're able to thin out the number of applicants, use this as kind of a hurdle that people need to get over before they can obtain their permanent residence under this program, then you're going to get a lot fewer applicants, and that's going to hopefully improve processing times for everybody else participating in the program. So I can see why they're doing it, and you're right. Like with the government in Quebec right now, preserving the French language in the province of Quebec is a huge priority for them. So we really shouldn't be surprised to see this requirement in there.
Right. Okay, Vince. So that's the recap on the plan to reform the Quebec Immigrant Investor Program. As you said, there's a little over a month left for people to state their claim or state their opinion to the government of Quebec. We'll see if there's any changes. We think that the framework is going to stay pretty much intact.
Yeah, and I would just say, I'm just going to add here, if I'll probably suggest some changes myself. Personally, I would like to see maybe, I think they could probably get away with a longer residency requirement, so maybe require applicants to stay in Quebec a little longer, but reduce that French requirement maybe from a level 7 to a level 5.
Okay.
I don't know. We'll see what they come up with, but I think the program would be a lot more appealing to people if that French requirement was brought down a little bit. And the last thing I want to say is if you've watched this presentation today and you've decided that you're absolutely not interested because either it's too expensive or because of the French requirement or the proof of funds requirement or whatever, just keep in mind there are other options out there. Okay, we still do have those entrepreneur programs that I mentioned at the beginning. If you're willing to come to Canada and roll up your sleeves and do business here, there's still other programs available to you. And there's also international programs. Like I said, I mean, there was a time when Canada was the only game in town. Now we have U.S. investor immigration, European investor immigration, Caribbean citizenship by investment. So there are other options available, depending on what you're looking for. So, you can come talk to me about it, send me an email, and we can discuss the best option for you. But like I said, at the end of the day, it's good to see this program back. And it's another option for clients. It might not be for everybody, but the more options that are out there that are on the table, the better as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent. Okay, Vince Lalonde, Lalonde at pacelawfirm.com. Drop him an email. Vince, thanks for this, and we'll catch up in a month or two, and we'll see where things landed.
Yeah, be curious to see what we come up with at the end of the day. But yeah, it's a positive start.
Indeed. Okay, take care, Vince. Bye-bye.
Thanks.